Selamat malam, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is good to see you again. I'm Farah, your host for this program. We connecting culture, art, science to UK Indonesian museum collections. We Collect is a series of research seminars and creative laboratory programs that will create dialogues and connect expertise between a range of heritage practitioners and researchers from UK and Indonesia, as well as a network of researchers, curators, and artists from both countries. It is made possible by the British Council Grant Connecting to Culture 2023, and I would like to give special thanks to Director General Culture of Indonesia, Museum and Cagar Budaya, and Indonesia TV, as well as most especially Science Museum Group London for this collaboration. This is our research seminar series number 3, with a number of curators and researchers dealing with Indonesia and Southeast Asia collection in Britain, Indonesia, and also from Netherlands. We are having with us our speakers, Melinda in Leiden, Nick, Alexandra, Yoshika, and Adrian in London, and Saja, actually from Indonesia, but now it's actually in Hong Kong. Before we start, I would like to introduce our chair for this research seminar, number 3, Melinda Susanto. Melinda Susanto is a PhD candidate at the Institute for History, Leiden University. Her current research investigates how botanical and medical knowledge played a role in interactions between Asian courts and the Dutch East India Company in the early modern period. Her research interests include the intersections between natural history and visual and material culture, and the role of South and Southeast Asia in global circulations of knowledge. Between 2014 and 2018, she worked as assistant curator at the National Gallery Singapore, where she developed projects on prints, photography, and printed books from and of Southeast Asia, and further explored connected histories between Asia and Europe. Okay, without further ado, I hand over to Melinda for chairing this session and introducing our distinguished guests. Over to you, Melinda.
Thank you, Farah, for your kind introduction and invitation for me to moderate this session. Good evening and good afternoon to everyone. I'm pleased to open this research seminar session entitled Exploring Current Trends of Collection Management, Interpretation and Audiences for Southeast Asia Heritage and Material Culture in Indonesia and the UK. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the session, Mr. Nick Barnard. Nick Barnard is a curator of South and Southeast Asian art in the Asian department of the Victoria and Albert Museum. He specializes in South Asian jewelry and sculpture and the arts of the Jain religion. Since 2020, he has begun to cover some aspects of work on the V&A's Southeast Asian art collection. Publications include his book Indian Jewelry, the V&A Collection, and numerous articles and contributions to books on a wide range of subjects. He is currently writing an article on South Indian Jain sculpture. In 2011, he carried out a redisplay of the V&A South Asian Sculpture Gallery and has curated various displays, including Jain manuscript pages and paintings, 2010 to 2012, and Musical Wonders of India, 2015, a digital exhibition and display co-curated with Darbar Arts Cultural Heritage. He regularly lectures on the V&A Academy's Arts of Asia course and the School of Oriental and African Studies postgraduate diploma in Asian art, recently including field gallery tours of South Asian and Buddhist art. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much indeed, Melinda. Can you hear me all right? Lovely,
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen and hope that I can bring up the PowerPoint. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint screen okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Lovely. Okay, great, thank you. So I'd just like to introduce you first to the Victoria and Albert Museum. The museum opened in South Kensington in London in 1857, and at first it was called the South Kensington Museum. It was renamed the Victoria and Albert Museum, or V&A, in 1899, when Queen Victoria laid the foundation stone of these new buildings. This is the range of the museum completed in 1909. This view from the museum garden shows some of the older buildings. The lecture theatre block containing some of the oldest buildings was built in the 1860s. So the South Kensington Museum, now V&A's collections, their Asian collections, really began to grow with purchases from the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, held in London in 1851. The Great Exhibition was seen by over 6 million visitors from around the world, and it took place in the Crystal Palace, this great glass building that was specially built to house it. So, in line with this exhibition, the new museum aimed to improve the standard of British design, manufacture, and public taste. So although British technology was advanced, these aspects were thought to have fallen behind the design standards of other countries, especially the French, who were the commercial rivals, in the design of ornaments. So by showing the best examples from around the world, including Southeast Asia, they aimed to raise the standards in Britain. So this tied up with a design reform movement, which aimed to make the shape of any object suitable to its function. So this is why the South Kensington Museum started to buy examples of Asian decorative arts, such as metalwork, jewellery, arms and armour, woodwork and textiles, especially at first from India, but also from Southeast Asia. So one of the objects bought from the Great Exhibition by the South Kensington Museum, just after the exhibition closed, is this Burmese gold necklace from Tenasserim. And it's this description in the first report of the Department of Practical Art of 1853, which is effectively the museum's first catalogue, shows the detailed concerns of the new museum with the principles of design. So they wrote, quote, "The way in which the forms are here massed, gradually diminishing in bulk from the inner ring to the extremities, is well worthy of study. The variety of line produced by the position of the several forms, the judicious amount of relief in each, with the elegance of the forms themselves, render this necklace a valuable object for study." So you can see how they're looking at very specific aspects of each object to see why they want to show it in the new museum, to inspire people with good examples of designed work. So these objects were all bought from the Great Exhibition by the South Kensington Museum in 1852. And part of these foundational Asia collections, and it shows really the diversity of these collections. So the scarf on the top left was actually purchased as Thai, but then was described as China silk in the first inventory of 1852. So you have a sense of them not necessarily learning about the objects as they went along. Now, the museum's South and Southeast Asian collections actually have much earlier origins. In 1798, the board of directors of the East India Company, whose headquarters were here at East India House in Leadenhall Street in the city of London, decided to set up a library for manuscripts collected by their colonial employees in India. And that quickly became a museum as well from about 1801. So it was called the Indian Museum. It was located at first here in Leadenhall Street. So the collections included material not only from India, but from lots of other Asian countries, including from Southeast Asia. Now, eventually in 1879, the Indian Museum's collections were dispersed and over 19,000 objects were transferred to the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A. So this slide is just to show you the vast range of objects collected by the Indian Museum, several from Indonesia, including the piece from Celebes on the top left, two examples from Myanmar on the top left. There's a textile from Timor at the bottom right, a kris from Malaysia, and a Thai bowl on the bottom left. So these collections started at an early date in 1852 and then were greatly augmented by these Indian Museum collections added in 1879 to 80, and they continue collecting, making the collections bigger and bigger. So the total collections from mainland and island Southeast Asia numbers something like 3,500 items. There's a small group of very high quality early sculptures from Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar and Cambodia. But the large majority of the collection is made of objects made in the 19th and 20th centuries. So the Indonesian material is particularly strong in textiles, batiks and ikats, and puppets and arms. The Thai and Malay collections are strong in metalwork. The Cambodian collections are quite small, but they've increased recently. In the last sort of 50 years or so. The collection from Myanmar of nearly 2,000 objects is the largest of the Southeast Asian collections, and that's obviously we can't have to be open about our colonial origins, and of course I'm sure a large part of the reason for these large collections from Myanmar is the colonial period and the annexation of Burma by Britain in 1885. But the collections started before that from Myanmar, and they can carried on being added to after Burmese independence. And so it includes sculpture, musical instruments, lacquer vessels, gold and silver vessels, jewellery, and lots of textiles, books, weapons, furniture boxes, and architectural woodwork. So huge and wide-ranging collections. So Southeast Asian art can be seen in several galleries in the V&A, and prominent among these are the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation's galleries of Buddhist art. And this shows one of the 4 rooms with 2 others visible in the distance. So it's quite unusual for the V&A, which sees itself primarily as a secular space, to dedicate spaces overtly to the productions of any one particular religion, although we do also have a gallery of Islamic art. But the Buddhist galleries gave an opportunity to show objects from many different Asian countries together. So the museum's exhibition mode entrance can be seen through the archway, and these galleries are also located to the large new exhibition gallery. So in addition to those who come to see the Buddhist galleries in their own right, a lot of people pass through these rooms on their way to exhibitions, to the cafe, which is at the end of this gallery, or to other galleries. So they felicitously discover Buddhist art on their way through. So there's a lot of footfall in these galleries. So this room shows, the subject of this room is the life of the Buddha. This was opened in 2017. From the birth of the Buddha with the Gandharan reliefs in the center of this picture to the nirvana of the Buddha. And in the foreground is a pillar from Bodh Gaya, the site where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. But in the center of the gallery, you can see the Dharma Chakra, or Wheel of the Law from Thailand, representing the Buddha's first teachings. So this is a Dharma Chakra made of limestone, which comes from Thailand, from the Dvaravati period, 7th, 8th century. It's one of around 50 examples, of which, of course, the majority are in Thailand. The Wheel of the Law, the Dharma Chakra, would have been on a supporting pillar, probably octagonal in shape, and the hollowed out hub in the center would have held a relief, probably showing the Buddha in a teaching posture, which would have been attached by a metal rod. So this large limestone Wheel of the Law was formerly the property of a German resident, Dr. Oswald Schwendt, who was a resident in Bangkok in the 1930s, displayed it in Germany in Offenbach in 1963, and it was eventually given to the V&A by John and Fausta Eskenazi, who are leading art dealers in London. The second room of the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation galleries shows Mahayana Buddhism and the Bodhisattva path. And in the middle of the picture, you can see the brown plaster casts on the walls. These are reproductions of scenes on the stupa at Borobudur in Java. So the upper one we'll look at first. They're tinted plaster casts, and they're part of a set of 5 that were made in the Netherlands in about 1900. And the V&A bought them from the Kolonial Institute in Amsterdam. Originally, the museum wanted a complete set, but things were disrupted by the First World War, and they finally got the plaster cast in 1926, but eventually there was a selection of 5 rather than the complete set of 24 moulds. So they show the importance of plaster casts and reproductions of the V&A. The museum's founding director, Sir Henry Cole, had a great conference in 1867 on reproductions of works of art. So the idea was that students could study the great works of art from around the world, particularly architecture and sculpture, even though they couldn't travel to the countries of origin. So this scene shows the Lalita Vistara version of the life of Gautama Buddha, and it shows the archery contest in which Prince Siddhartha, standing in the center, holding his arrow, is competing against other youths for the hand of the Princess Yashodhara. King Shuddhodana is sitting on the right, and on the left is the Buddha's rival Devadatta firing his arrow. And this plaster cast is the one below it, which shows a scene from the Ganda Vyuha, a Mahayana treatise, and it shows the enlightenment of Prince Sudana, who's shown in the center, seated, who is receiving instruction from the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra, who's shown on the raised platform on the left of the picture. So plaster casts and also photographs were an important part of the V&A's collecting from its early days. The third room of the Buddhist galleries shows tantric art and the route to rapid enlightenment. A lot of the images are from the Himalayas, but on the left is a bodhisattva from central Java, dating from the 9th to 10th century. Then a final room of these Ho Foundation Buddhist galleries show the image of the Buddha in Asia, and they show the way that the Buddha image spread from India, if you look on the right of the screen, from Mathura and Gandhara all the way through Asia, and the galleries now go up to the 20th century with a Thai painting. And there are several objects from Southeast Asia in these galleries. So in the center, you can see two standing Buddhas from Thailand and Myanmar, and a seated Buddha from Myanmar. There are also other objects, but in the very center, behind those standing Buddhas, you can see the very large wooden gilt shrine from Myanmar, which I'm going to look at now. So this is certainly one of the largest and most spectacular objects from Southeast Asia in the V&A's collection. It was made in about 1850 to 1880. It's made of teak with gilded lacquer, semi-precious stones and mirrors. The woodwork is extremely elaborate with very high quality carving. There's intricate scroll work covered with lacquer and gold. And the shrine, the structure of the shrine is built up of a series of parts built up in layers, so it can be dismantled into smaller sections. So near the top is an image of the crowned Buddha Shakyamuni in the Bhumisparsha posture, calling the earth goddess to witness his resistance of the temptations of the evil god Mara and his readiness for enlightenment. And that's why this shrine fits well with the image of the Buddha gallery. It's this form of the Buddha, but also the very regal way in which he's displayed on this wasted throne in ways that suggest that it's probably a royal shrine that might have come originally from the palace at Mandalay. And below the Buddha is a figure, an attendant figure, perhaps Saka or Brahma, holding a lamp up. And then there are numerous other vessels, offering vessels and stupa-shaped vessels in the foreground. There's a box to contain manuscripts and two manuscripts that it contained. And on either side, there are images of the Buddha's leading disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana. It's a very complicated and elaborate and impressive object. The provenance goes back to the colonial period. As you know, the British annexed Burma at the Third Anglo-Burmese War in 1885, and this object was acquired by a Lieutenant Colonel Rakes, who was a district commissioner of Sagaing at the end of the 19th century. He took the object back to Britain from Burma with him. He gave it to Bristol City Museum in 1906. It was deaccessioned in 1966 and eventually purchased by the V&A on the art market in 1969. Now, so these are the Buddhist galleries. And as I mentioned, it's a little unusual to have galleries dedicated to a religion, but we also have galleries dedicated to geographical regions. And these galleries show the Himalayas and Southeast Asia. So the Southeast Asian half is at the further end of this gallery. And you can see it here with arts from Thailand on the right, and then displays from other countries in Southeast Asia on the left, which you can see here. So we have we have on the right-hand end of this picture, we have art from Malaysia and Indonesia. The case is flanked by 4 sculptures from Indonesia. In the center is a case displaying objects from Cambodia, and on the left are 2 cases showing objects from Myanmar. And one of the most spectacular of these is this betel nut container, which was part of the royal regalia of the Burmese monarchy. It's made of gold set with rubies and imitation emeralds. And the regalia, the royal regalia of Burma was seized by the British when they captured Mandalay in 1885, and it was taken back to London with the idea that it would form reparations for the cost of the British incurred in the war with Burma, which seems bitterly ironic, of course, nowadays, but that's how they thought about it at the time. Now, some of the pieces from this regalia, which included 160 gold-encrusted objects, ceremonial robes of the last king and queen of Burma, some of those objects were sold off and the pieces were melted down. But it's really thanks to the intervention of George Burwood, who was a curator of the Indian Museum and then the art referee of the South Kensington Museum, who argued strongly that these objects should not be sold off and potentially destroyed by being melted down for their material value. So he helped to save the objects and had them deposited in the Victoria and Albert Museum and the South Kensington Museum in 1890. So those objects, 144 of them, stayed in the V&A from 1890 until 1964. And in 1964, they were returned to Myanmar. And there's a very interesting story about this that was my late colleague John Clark, who was the curator of our Southeast Asian collections, very sadly passed away in 2020. But he wrote a very interesting article about the Mandalay regalia in a book called Returning Southeast Asia's Past. And the further details are in there. So when the V&A, with the I think the fairly enthusiastic support of the keeper of the Asia Department, John Irwin, and with the encouragement of the British government, returned the Mandalay regalia to Burma in 1964. The Burmese government very generously gave this particular object to the V&A in recognition of the safekeeping of the Mandalay regalia. Again, it seems a little odd now, but I think it was partly in recognition of the way that the museum tried to save and keep the regalia together, and also helped to protect it from bomb damage when moving it out of London during the Second World War. So anyway, that's the explanation of that slightly strange seeming term. The kunit, the beetle box, is in the shape of a karawake, a mythological bird. I'm very grateful to Alex Green for lots of guidance on our Burmese objects, particularly. Filigree gold with ruby eyes and bands of imitation emeralds. Here's a view of the Indonesian and Malaysian display. Detailed, showing the quite wide range of objects that are on display now, including shadow puppets, for example. And here's an altar relief made of volcanic stone. It shows, it dates from about 1425, and it comes probably from East Java. It might have had a ritual function as a seat to the gods. And the relief shows Krishna, accompanied by Satyabhama, acquiring the magic wish-fulfilling tree of Parijata, which is a legend from a popular Javanese court poem. And the tree contains a pear-like fruit and a peacock-like bird, but what you can't see when it's on display in the gallery is the back, where there's a beautiful carving of trees with intertwined trunks. And the relief was purchased from the Royal Asiatic Society in 1979, but they'd had it since 1832, when they'd been given it by a resident of Surabaya in East Java, so a much older provenance than would appear from the museum records. Within the Southeast Asia Gallery is a special display of the arts of Thailand, which was supported by the Royal Thai government in honour of the 80th birthday of the former King Bhumibol Adulyadej in 2007. So on the left is a display of the early Thai kingdoms, mainly showing Buddhist sculptures. In the centre, works of art associated with the Bangkok court, and on the right, objects created for Buddhist and Brahmanical ceremonies. Now, the V&A has always collected contemporary art. So a lot of the objects they were buying back in 1852 were things that had been made within the last few years. They were then contemporary objects. With this, the V&A's key mission as the UK's National Museum of Art, Design and Performance. Design and contemporary art and craft are really at the sort of centre of our mission, if you like. So these are contemporary objects acquired from Thailand, the choker and matching earrings, which I'll show you in a moment. And they were created in Bangkok by two designers at the Royal College of Goldsmiths, Santi Pongchan and Nippon Yodkrampan, both senior lecturers who worked on the design and the making of these very beautiful pieces of jewellery. And the techniques are fascinating because they use gold weaving with linked wires or woven gold. And it's a modern reuse of an ancient woven gold technique that was used in medieval Thai gold work, as was seen in the regalia excavated from stupas at Ayutthaya. So it's contemporary design, but using traditional techniques with a distinctively Thai feel. And the makers of these pieces were interviewed by my late colleague John Clark in 2006. This one was the choker was made in 2002, and these matching earrings were made in 2003. So very beautiful. And they're taking the form of a flower, I believe it's called Dok Pip, which is very popular in Thailand. So again, merging sort of Thai imagery. So the V&A, that shows you the Southeast Asia Gallery, and we've seen examples of the Ho Family Foundation Buddhist galleries. There are also some examples of Southeast Asian art elsewhere in the museum, 3 examples of Burmese silverwork in the silver galleries, and a large number of Southeast Asian ceramics in our ceramics galleries on the top floor, with the largest number from Thailand. In addition, there's an extensive stored collection, including textiles, which are light sensitive, so can't be on permanent display, and numerous other artifacts. The store collection is currently in the process of moving from our store in Blythe House to the new Storehouse facility in East London, which will provide a new visitor experience with much easier access than the traditional appointment-only museum store. So in addition to trying to make its collections as accessible as possible, the museum does strive to make information on them as available as possible, which of course is particularly pressing with the current decolonisation movement. And provenance files on our objects in our collection are all available for viewing in the public by appointment. In September 2022, a delegation from Cambodia concerned with artifacts which were looted during the Cambodian Civil War visited the V&A, and of course they were given full access to all our records and shown all the Cambodian sculptures available in the museum and its Blythe House store. I think there were just 2 that we couldn't show because they were in deep storage in the country, 2.5 hours drive from London, but they saw everything else. I think that was a very fruitful and productive meeting. So work to make information on provenance of the museum's Asian collections generally more available is good. It's an enormous task, but it's certainly going to be one of the museum's important priorities in the coming years. We also make our collections more physically accessible through the new storehouse. So that brings me to the end. I hope that's all made sense. I hope I didn't make any mistakes, and thank you very much for listening to that.
So thank you, Nick, for your presentation and insight into the V&A's collection. We'll have a discussion and Q&A at the end. So for now, we'll move straight on to the next speaker. Now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Sadia Boonstra. Dr. Sadia Boonstra is a historian and curator with a broad cultural practice. Based in Jakarta, Indonesia, she is currently an independent curator, appointed honorary fellow at Melbourne University, and also the main consultant for the MCB group. Research-informed and audience-oriented, she combines her academic expertise with experience in curation, producing, and public engagement programs. From her 15 years of experience, she has worked with artists, governments, and cultural organizations in Indonesia, Australia, and the Netherlands. In 2020, she founded PT Culture Lab Consultancy as the foundation of her works. Through PT Culture Lab Consultancy, Sadia offers the service of concept development, research training, and talks on the legacies of cultural history, heritage, and the performing arts of colonial and contemporary Indonesia. So over to you, Sadia.
Thank you so much, Melinda, for your kind introduction. And also thank you, Farah, for inviting me today, and also for the support of the British Council. And I'm super happy to be here. And today, because you heard my whole bio, so thank you for that. I'm actually speaking as I'm not necessarily the main consultant of Museum and Cagar Budaya, which is in English, we translate it as Indonesian Agency for Museums and Cultural Heritage. But we consist of a team, a transition team that consists of 4 people, of which I am responsible for collections and curatorial. So that is what I would like to share a little bit more about with you today. So I also wasn't really sure, like, to what extent everybody is familiar with the Indonesian Agency for Museums and Heritage. So I'll start sharing my screen. Yeah. Okay. So here it is again. So today I'll be speaking as head of collections and curatorial of the transition team. at the Indonesian Agency for Museums and Cultural Heritage. So today I'm talking about like this period of transformation, or this transformation that the organization is going through, and where we are in terms of like approaches to collections and content. So the vision of the Indonesian agency is as follows: to become a collaborative space for exploring cultural and historical heritage and encouraging creativity, social change, and building a cultured character. So the mission is these 6 points, but for today, I will not like read all of these 6 points, but focus on the first one, that we are focused on realizing sustainable management of collections, cultural heritage, and historical buildings. And from my perspective, I will be focusing on collections. And what this new agency does is that basically it unites 40 museums, galleries, and heritage sites under one umbrella, which falls under the Ministry for Culture, Education, Research, and Technology. So here we have, from left to right, we have the National Museum, we have the National Gallery, we have Museum Benteng Vredenburg in Yogyakarta. We also have the Presidential Museum Balai Kirti in Bogor. We have the prehistorical UNESCO World Heritage Site Sangiran, as well as Borobudur. Then we also have Museum Basuki Abdullah. We also have the museum where the proclamation was formulated. We have the Museum Sumpah Pemuda, which could be translated as the Youth Pledge. We have the Museum of the National Awakening. We have Minha Museum. We have the Batik Museum. We have another prehistorical museum, Songtrus, as well as Semedo. So these are 14 museums and galleries and heritage sites that will be all united under one umbrella. But for this year, we're focusing on one museum in particular, which is the Museum Nacional, the National Museum. So a little bit of background about the National Museum is that it was actually founded in the 18th century in 1778 as the Royal Batavian Society of Arts, which was basically a group of people that was interested in the arts and sciences, art and culture of the Indonesian archipelago. So this was a Dutch society, basically. They had some smaller rooms in the north and in the older part of Jakarta, Batavia at the time. But when the collections grew too big, they actually moved to another space where they opened at the location where we currently still are situated in 1868. After independence, the museum became briefly the Indonesian Cultural Institute. And then in 1962, it became the Central Museum. And only in 1979, it became the National Museum. But since the museum was actually started to be formed in the 18th century under the guidance of the Royal Batavian Society of Arts and Sciences, many of the collections or the collections in the museum are basically founded on colonial collection practices, as well as the European perspectives that sort of like are foundational for the ways in which the collections were formed. So these are some images. So on the left-hand side, you see the original building. So basically that building still exists. In the middle, in the center, you see the courtyard with archaeological statues. And then you see another angle of the museum. So since the old building still exists, but of course it also we also have some newer buildings, and we're currently actually renovating a number of buildings, and we are planning to renovate a number of these existing buildings as well, but I will get to that later. So the collections of Museum Nacional are actually close to 200,000 objects. It's a little bit less but it's around 200,000 objects. So quite a significant number. It's comparable to the Trophy Museum in the Netherlands, for example, which basically holds a very similar collection, because when the the Royal Batavian Society started collecting, they kept the main objects in Jakarta, in Batavia at the time, and then sent the objects that were of slightly lesser quality or duplicates, they would send to Amsterdam, to what at the time was the Colonial Institute, and has become over time merged into the Trophy Museum, which is now part of the National Museum of Wereldculturen. So this collection consists of 7 categories. So there's prehistory, there's archaeology, ethnography, ceramics, we have history collections, there's geography, numismatics, and heraldry. I think the interesting thing about this also is that these categories were also created by the Royal Batavian Society. So this is something that is important, I think, from my perspective, is that these collections in the National Museum currently have their roots in the colonial period, as well as the way in which the collections are categorized and cataloged. So here are a number of objects, just to give you an impression. So on the left-hand side, I just wanted to point that out also in connection to what Nick was also like referring to. On the left-hand side, we see the saddle of Diponegoro's horse. Prince Diponegoro was a prince from Central Java who in 1825 started a war of resistance against the occupation by the Dutch. Basically, the war took 5 years, and then finally Diponegoro was defeated, and then a number of objects, that personal belongings, were taken from him, and then subsequently brought to the Netherlands, where they remained for a very long time. And this saddle was returned in the 1970s as part of the joint cultural recommendations between Indonesia and the Netherlands. So there's a growing number of objects that have been coming back to the National Museum, which originate from the colonial period, and in the colonial period have been transported to the Netherlands, and then subsequently are coming back. So as I pointed out, so for me, what is interesting to see is that these categories of the collections, for example, still root in sort of like colonial European Eurocentric perspectives. Curatorially too, in exhibitions, in our exhibition making practices, of course the building is still the original building, but for example, this map, as you can see here, which was made by Mas Pingadi in 1931, is a map that indicates the diversity of the Indonesian archipelago. But this map in particular was actually made for the 1931 World Exhibition in Paris, where at the time the Dutch pavilion, where it was exhibited in the Dutch pavilion at the time. And as such, it was supposed to indicate the greatness of the Dutch colony in the Indonesian archipelago. So it was meant to indicate all the different tribes, all the different communities and groups of people that were inhabiting the Indonesian archipelago to the greater glory of the Dutch. This map is still on display in the museum, although the small paintings that you see here are replicas, while the originals are being kept in the storage spaces. But these maps, for example, they don't indicate, there is no indication of like the original intent of the map, why these maps were used in the museums to help visualize the progress of humanity, to help map races in the archipelago, but thereby also constructing race and constructing racial hierarchies. So there is some critical perspectives that are lacking in our exhibition making practices and also towards our collection management that we would like to work on in the future. So here as well, this is a wall that which exhibits colonial photographs. It's supposed to indicate like the different types of dresses of the different cultural groups in Indonesia. But again, here there is no reflection on the origin of these photos, the context in which they were made, and to what extent, for example, also images like this contribute to the construction of race and racial hierarchies. So I've only pointed to some main issues that we've been seeing over the past few months, maybe also for a little bit of background. So basically we started this transition period last September, basically, September 2022. So we've been reassessing the collections and the curatorial practices, and based on the assessment, we have identified a number of priority programs for collection and exhibition transformation that we will start in this year. So basically it's already April, so we have 8 months left to start with this work. And obviously it's not going to be finished, but at least we hope to be able to make starts with these. So the first one is really a reorganization of the storage spaces. I didn't show you any images, but a lot of the storage spaces are in need of a reorganization, where we see, for example, objects that are still stacked on each other, on top of each other, but we would like to clean and tidy up the storage spaces and make it more manageable. A second program that we're implementing is basically a collection management system. At this point, we don't have an actual, a proper collection management system. So as you can imagine, with 200,000 objects, but without a proper collection management system and a properly organized storage space, it's actually quite hard to manage the collections in a proper way. So we're implementing a collection management system so that we would be able to keep track of our collections, to assign locations, basically to just do all the management, to level up the collection management. And as I pointed out earlier, we're also rethinking the current exhibitions in Museum Nasional. So as I said, like an important part of that is to decolonize the collection management as well as the collection exhibition making practices. So for example, with the implementation of the collection management, we would also, management system, we would also very much like to review the categories, the existing categories, and see how we can develop that into a more decolonial approach. Because the categories as they exist, and since they are rooted in the colonial period, it does limit, it does shape and direct the ways in which we can look at our collection, in which we can do research in the collection, in which we are then also able to create and produce new knowledge about these collections. So it is important to rethink the existing categories of our collections and to try to also change that while we're implementing the collection management system. In terms of rethinking the current exhibitions, the plan for this year is, because obviously it needs quite some time to really redo and refurbish a whole museum. So what we are planning to do this year is to first rethink the current exhibition practices, past exhibition practices, and also past practices of looking at our collections. We would like to invite artists and communities, historians, etc. Anyone who is interested in the collections or who has a relation with, possible relation with the history of these collections and the history of Indonesia. We would like to invite them to come and rethink with us the current exhibitions. So, for example, also the slide that I showed you earlier with all of the statues in the courtyard, for example, that we will have to rethink how have these objects been collected, in what kind of context have these objects been collected, but also how have these objects been displayed and presented to the audience over the past centuries, and how can we rethink that and revisit that in order to be able to create new stories and new perspectives on our history, on our collections, and on our exhibitions. So we will start doing that this year as well. And meanwhile, we also working on the implementation of international museum standards. So currently, none of our spaces, neither the storage spaces or the exhibition spaces, actually meet international museum standards, in the sense that the fluctuations in temperature and humidity are very high at the moment. And we would like to raise these standards such that we would be able to also invite international exhibitions to Indonesia, so that we would be more connected also to global discourses of museological discourse, art discourse, historical discourse, so that we can really also upgrade these standards to basically to meet the quality of the collection, because as I mentioned earlier, the collection of Museum Nasional is very unique. It's really amazing and really deserves to be honored and to be celebrated as such as well. And then okay, I think I wrongly calculated, but the 5th program is a refurbishment of exhibitions in all 14 locations. So this is something that also is more for the intended for the longer term, in which we will work with the teams in each of the locations to review the existing exhibitions. We, for example, see we see a lot of, for example, dioramas and a lot of storylines that are still rooted in a very Eurocentric perspective on, for example, how excavations have been done in Indonesia, or when this type of history started. And most of these narrations start in the colonial period. So we also want to review that. So it's going to be sort of like a project-based learning, because many of our colleagues of the teams do not necessarily have a museum background, but they're civil servants. So it will be a program in which we can think together about these exhibitions and how we can transform them and review them in ways that are more interesting and more relevant for future generations. So this is what we have in mind, what we're going to do. So basically, we're going to confront and challenge the coloniality of our institution and of the collections that it holds. The second one is really to find new models for knowledge, like how can we retrieve knowledge that was lost, silenced, and obscured by coloniality, but that are present in our collections. We need to find new ways to uncover that knowledge. And then thirdly, a way that we can do that is to relink with the demographic genealogies that preceded the colonial project. So what was there? What knowledge, what indigenous knowledge, what artistry was already there before the colonial period, but what has been silenced and what has been obscured by coloniality, and how can we retrieve that? So it's also very much about relinking with indigenous knowledge. And I wrote here, keeping the Bandung spirit alive. So this refers to the Bandung Conference of 1955, in which Indonesia was really very much a pioneer in forging and strengthening South-South relationships. So this is also very much something that we would like to do in order to be able to find new models for knowledge retrieval, to work together with countries that have had a similar experience and are going through similar transformations from a previously colonized country into decolonizing collections, decolonizing museums, in order to be able to reappropriate the knowledge that is actually there. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. Please feel free to ask me any questions afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadia, for your presentation, giving us an insight into these future plans we can look forward to. Now we can move on to our third speaker, Alexander Green from the British Museum. Alexander Green is Henry Ginsberg Curator for Southeast Asia at the British Museum. She has a PhD in Southeast Asian art history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and has written and edited numerous articles and books on her topic. Her books include Buddhist Visual Cultures, Rhetoric and Narrative in Late Burmese Wall Paintings, Burmese Silver from the Colonial Period, and Southeast Asia, A History in Objects, based on the British Museum's collections. Her past exhibition and book projects include work on Sir Stamford Raffles for the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore and the British Museum in 2019. Currently, she's preparing an exhibition on Myanmar's history and art for the British Museum in November 2023. So over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Melinda. Can everybody hear me okay? And I will try and share my screen. Great. I'm presuming everybody can see that. So,
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Melinda, for your kind introduction, and thank you to Farah and of course to the council for inviting me to be here today. So it's a great pleasure. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I was working on in 2019, in which I am now in the process of resurrecting. It's basically looking at the Raffles collections at the British Museum. So basically, Raffles formed very large collections during his tenure in Southeast Asia. He was there between 1805 and 1824. The majority of his material came from his time on Java, when he was lieutenant governor between 1811 and 1816. So the British Museum actually holds more than 2,000 objects associated with Raffles, collected by him. The majority, more than, well, about 1,500 are from Java. The remainder are Chinese coins found on Java. We have about 500 of those. And then we also have a few items from Sumatra, India, Burma or Myanmar, and Siam, Thailand. And there are just a couple objects from, possibly from Bali, and a few also from Madura. So again, a very eclectic mix, but with a very heavy focus on the island of Java. Of these collections, there are more than 360 drawings of Hindu-Buddhist sculpture and architecture. There are over 100 small metal sculptures. There are just a handful of examples, small examples in stone, again, all from Java. But then we also have more than 360 shadow puppets. We have over 130 masks, excuse me, 44 wayang kutik, 46 wayang kucil gilig, and then there are over 50 full-sized and model gamelan instruments, mostly models, but also some full-size ones. And then there are actually also some model figures and also a few Chris daggers. So Raffles acquired this material. Here's a picture of Raffles. He acquired basically these large groups of cultural material. And one of the things that I uncovered in the project in 2019 was that he had applied contemporary natural history collecting methods to the collation of particularly theatrical material. So he created typologies, he labeled all the objects in keeping with scientific procedures of the time. And this really set him apart from his contemporaries as his actions anticipated colonial collecting practices by several decades. So he was doing things in the early 19th century that other people started doing much later, several decades later. But because Raffles' papers were all lost when his ship sank in 1824, where and how he formed his collections is unknown. But by determining the origins of Raffles' collections, we can obtain a better understanding of both the development of Java later in the late 18th century and also Raffles' collecting methodologies, as well as information about the state of Hindu Buddhist antiquities in the early 19th century. So Raffles, one of the things he did was he was back in Britain between 1817 and 1818, during which time he wrote very quickly and published his History of Java in 2 volumes. This earned him a knighthood in 1817. And he used his collections for illustration in the volumes. The assumption, of course, has been that except for the drawings and the Hindu Buddhist material, that Raffles' collections were looted from the Yogyakarta court in 1812. And so one of the things that I started to do in 2018 and 2019 was to start assessing this. You know, how accurate is that assumption? And also to try and identify some of the drawings which weren't clearly labeled. So it seems that for the most part, an initial pass in terms of looking at provenance, that most of Raffles' material actually was not from the Yogyakarta court. So for example, the gamelan instruments, they come from 6 different orchestras. They're not a unified body. And actually many are stylistically similar to those from Northeast Java and also the island of Madura. And Raffles particularly had connections with the court in the north, Cirebon in the northwest, and Madura off the northeast coast. So we have here, for example, a kananga beater, and you can see this has one style, floral decoration, carved in quite high relief and gilded. Here we have another particular style of dender, which is an anthropomorphic form, and there are actually still gamelans that exist on Madura that have similar iconography to this one with Nagas and Garuda. And then we have this kacher, which is in yet a different style. And so, as I said, there are at least 6 possible different orchestras. So and if you group the instruments together, they definitely do not form a single body of material. So then in terms of the masks, many appear to be from Central Java. We also have some model masks. And those appear to have been made in Cirebon. We can see that there were 2 different workshops, at least, who produced the full-size masks. We have some, like this one, where the hair is carved and then painted, and then we have others where the hair is painted on. And the crudeness of the hair generally, particularly in the carved pieces, suggests that they were made on commission. And what's also interesting about the masks is that they are all unused. There are no signs that they have been, the bite cords have been bitten, and there certainly isn't any indication of sweat on the inside of the mask. They appear to have been new when Raffles acquired them. We're also looking to translate the old Javanese and the old English labels that are pasted inside. So again, so this is definitely ongoing work, but at least we've started to determine that it's unlikely that these were looted from the Yogyakarta court because they're all completely new. Also, as I said, some of the features suggest that they were made on commission as opposed to being produced for the court themselves. So the wayang kuchil, these are no longer found on Java at all. The British Museum has the largest collection in the world. We have 46. And again, there's been very little work on these. And you're probably wondering how this can be a puppet when it's standing on its base. Well, the rods have all been cut off, and many of the rods that would have been used to move the arms and hands are missing. So the fact that there aren't any left on Java, there are a few others in some American collections, but possibly these might have been an early wayang golek, maybe, or this was a particular tradition that was in decline. Again, further work needs to be done on these. And here's another one where she's got one of her arm rods, but all the main rods have been removed, presumably for transportation back to Britain or for easier display once they were in Britain. In terms of the wayang kulit, we've again done initial assessment. These, about half come from Cirebon, and the other half, about half of those are wayang gedog, which was not popular at the Yogyakarta court. So we're left with only about 100. Is there an issue with sound? Banging. I hope is that better? Anyhow, as I was saying, there about a quarter seem to have unknown provenance, but we're now starting to look, I'm trying to bring some scholars over from Indonesia and also from the United States to look at these puppets in greater detail so that we can start identifying carvers' marks. We can look for signs of usage, and then we can basically compare them stylistically with other known early collections in order to try and get a better sense of, of where these puppets might have originated. Then, oops. Oh, sorry, and here's another example. It's an example of the puppet Bima. And then we also have some wayang klitik. These are possibly from Central Javanese, or it's also been suggested from Eastern Javanese courts. Again, further research has to be done on these. It's probably unlikely that they were from Eastern Javanese courts, unless they came from the island of Madura, because Raffles really did have closer connections with Cirebon, Central Java, and Madura. So again, this requires further research. So basically, I think what's important is that we try and determine as far as possible where on Java the theatrical objects were made. And we're hoping to use the findings to evaluate these current assumptions that they were taken from the Jogja court, as I mentioned. So Raffles interacted extensively with a number of Javanese courts. And it's also possible that many of the objects were given to him as gifts. And part of what suggests this is that, again, if you were a Dalang and you took these 360 puppets, you would find it very difficult to give very many performances. For example, the character Arjuna, there are only 2 examples in the entire collection, but we have, dozens of monsters, of the ogres and demons. So again, it's the shape of the collection is very unusual, and it's not something that a Javanese would have formed. So again, it's unlikely again that these came wholesale from the Jogja court. More likely they came piecemeal from a variety of different courts. Then in terms of the gamelan instruments, Raffles also supposedly commissioned an orchestra. And so this investigation is hoping to be able to determine which of the 6 orchestras that are, parts of orchestras that we have in the museum were actually the commissioned examples. And then I think the identification of the courts where the objects originated, if we're able to do that, that will certainly provide further information into Raffles' political relationships and his collecting methodologies, and therefore will enable the museum to posit the provenance of the Raffles collection more clearly. And I have one more wayang critic. Oh, sorry, I have two more. And here, this is the character Ajar Pamengar from the Damar Wulam narratives. But the project isn't only confined to the theatrical material. Some of what I worked on in 2018 and 2019 was we tried to identify all the drawings. We've figured out that it was George Baker who did many of the drawings, who collected them into the 6 volumes that the British Museum currently holds. He edited them at the time, and this was partially, this occurred after Raffles' early death in 1826. It was 1827 when he went to help Lady Raffles as she was going to reissue the History of Java volumes, and wanted help with the images that were used. And you can see that this image explains what the site is, though it's actually wrong. It says it's the palace at Kalasan, and then Baker is written in his handwriting, published 1817. So we know that it was, this image was in the first volume. But so one of the things that I did in 2018 was we went around and we looked at different sites, and this actually has been identified now as Chandisari. So we were able to not only now have the information that was provided in the early 19th century, but now we're able to actually identify it appropriately. So it's not the palace at Kalasan. And then, for example, drawings like this. So we're also looking to see if we can identify the imagery. So this one obviously is a representation of that stone sculpture from Chandi Singasari. But one of the things that's quite interesting is that there are lots of drawings that haven't been identified so clearly, and we're trying to figure out where those sculptures are now. And we've managed to identify about 1/3 of the sculptures, to say what museum they are currently in. There are also multiple copies of these images. So, for example, the drawing on the right is in the British Museum. The one on the left is the same image, but then you get similar images in the Royal Asiatic Society and also the British Library. So we've been trying to work out who did the drawings, how many varieties of a single drawing there are, and where those various different drawings are located. So that's also been part of what we've worked on. And this material is all available in the British Museum's collections online. And then also, as I said, one of the things we wanted to do was to identify who drew them. So, for example, this one has comments by G.P. Baker, but we've identified the drawing as having been done by a man named H.C. Cornelius, a Dutch person who Raffles employed, who collected some of his drawings while Raffles was there. So, as I said, there's plenty of further work to be done. We've only identified about 1/3 of the sculptures, though most of the architectural images have been identified. And the project for this upcoming financial year, until the end of March 2024, is going to focus on the theatrical material, trying to identify, as I said, those stylistic analyses and also the maker's marks, and see if we can improve our understanding of where the different theatrical pieces originated. But then hopefully in the longer term, as we develop a larger project, we'll be able to advance further work on the drawings and the sculptures as well. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Alexandra, for this presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our last 2 speakers from the Welcome Collection, Yoshika Kobayashi and Adrian Plau. Yoshika Kobayashi is collections assistant at Welcome Collection doing the collection-wide manuscripts inventory. She holds a BA from the Camberwell College of the Arts. Adrian Plough is Manuscript Collections Information Analyst at Wellcome Collection. He holds a PhD in South Asia Studies from SOAS and is currently undertaking a Headley Fellowship with the Art Fund. Over to the both of you.
Oh, thank you very much, Melinda. Can you all see my screen? Is that all clear and ready to go? Yeah.
Yes, maybe you could put it in slideshow mode.
Yep, like so, for instance. Yes. All right. Thank you very much, Melinda, for your kind introduction, and thank you also, Farah, for inviting us to this this panel today. And indeed, thank you to all of our fellow speakers who just been sharing their work and their thoughts. And thank you, of course, also to everybody who's joined in and listening today. And we're keenly aware that we're at the very end of this panel, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that people want to get to, so we'll try and be quick in getting through this. And one thing I should say at first is that Yoshika and myself, we are both collections management professionals, but neither of us are specialists in Southeast Asia. So we're very happy and honored to be with you here today, and are very glad to have the opportunity to learn. And I sincerely hope that we don't make any terrible mistakes in the following. If anything, I think we're just aiming to give you a bit of an overview and a bit of a general impression of the kinds of things that we are up to at Wellcome Collection when it comes to our Southeast Asian manuscripts. So speaking a bit more particularly about Wellcome Collection and Henry Wellcome himself in many ways, some of you might be aware Wellcome Collection is a part of the Wellcome Trust, which was founded in 1936 on the passing of Sir Henry Wellcome himself, who was a pharmaceutical entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and also a medical history enthusiast, and in many ways an eccentric and complicated figure, but an enormous interest in everything pertaining to the history of science and medicine, broadly understood. He had a number of collecting agents and purchasing agents in his employ for decades, who'd purchase all kinds of items and objects through auction houses, through purchasing networks, and also by simply traveling throughout much of the world and purchasing and commissioning items on site. Of course, thus hardly needs spelling out the colonial context in which this would be possible, and also, of course, the much of the racist and the supremacist thinking that underpinned the kinds of strategies and choices that were made, and of course the power imbalances that enabled purchases like this throughout much of the world. Another element is, of course, that Henry Wellcome's purchasing strategy was very inclusive, if you want to put it that way. When in doubt, the answer would be yes. So the collection that we sit with now is in many ways ostensibly related to medicine and science, but the actual span of items is much wider than that. And I think if we talk about the kinds of expectations that the audiences in the UK and actually all over the world might have a Wellcome Collection and the kind of material that is held, it is typically that, yes, it will have all these things related to medicine, science, health, but in reality, the holdings are much more diverse and varied than that. So turning to the manuscripts, I mean, many parts of the collection were dispersed to the Science Museum following Henry Wellcome's passing, so that we mainly deal with the manuscripts there, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about. About 30,000 manuscripts all in all, from every single continent, spanning more than 3 millennia of recorded time. Many languages, many scripts, all kinds of formats, and incredible diversity, again, when it comes to the different kinds of materials on view. Around 260 of these are from Southeast Asia, and I've provided somewhat an approximate breakdown of these here. You can see that the Burmese Pali is quite strong, and Thai as well, and then you have some smaller collections as well. So as a part of the whole manuscript collection, it's perhaps not that much, but it's still, I think, a quite substantial holding, and certainly enough to keep many people busy. In terms of the way we manage these, in terms of cataloging information and in terms of collections management, I just want to say a little bit more general about how we go about it. I mean, ultimately, we want to work towards increased accessibility and discoverability of all the information we hold. And I think Wellcome Collection, like most other GLAM institutions, particularly the ones with colonial legacies, have the same situation where there is an enormous amount of material, but there's also an enormous amount of legacy information available that might be sitting in all kinds of different sources. So there might be, like in our case, we have some information in an archive cataloging software system. Some is in a library cataloging service, some is in printed catalogs, some is in handwritten notes that sit in this kind of gray literature area and that might be circulated internally and sometimes externally, and so on and so forth, so that if you want to go and access some of the information, there's actually very many places you might have to look to just find out what are the manuscripts that we hold. So the step that we have taken is to adopt TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, a digital tool and methodology for the representation of any kind of source material in a digital format. We've been working with that over the last couple of years to bring absolutely all, that's the aim, to have all of the different kinds of cataloging information brought in line within the same format, TEI files, essentially. So I have this this little overview here of the sort of the direction of travel, if you will, where you have the manuscript. We might have some legacy information. We'll take what we can use from the legacy information, coupled with any kind of fresh cataloging that we might be able to generate a TEI file, which is an individual file for that manuscript, which is then in the end prepared to display on our front end. You have a little example of that there. But the TEI file itself is also made available open access for anybody to use for anything, essentially. It could be researchers, but it could also be other institutions, other kinds of catalogs. They might create union catalogs, for instance. All of our Arabic manuscripts cataloging information is also part of the Fihrist union database of Islamic manuscripts in the UK, and a great many of our Indic manuscripts are also being, our TEI files for those are being entered into a consolidated database for South Asian manuscripts held in institutions outside of South Asia. So that's one way that we work with that, and I can answer any questions about that later or by email. But of course, all of this work is not very meaningful if people ask to see any of these manuscripts and we can't actually produce them. And that's where the hugely important manuscript inventory comes in. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague Yoshika to say a bit more about that.
Thank you, Adrian. So the inventory project is part of a collection-wide drive towards museum and archive accreditation standard collections management. And the aim is to inventory the entire manuscripts collection, so every single item, both catalogued and uncatalogued. And as Adrian's already said, the TEI cataloging work has been done remotely. So inventory makes sure that the physical items match their metadata. And additionally, we check for condition and location and assign unique main identifiers. So the aim is to make sure that as much as possible, the material is retrievable and accessible to library visitors. So next slide, please. So we're now going to take a look at a couple of examples of Southeast Asian manuscript collections. Wellcome has 11 catalogued Javanese manuscripts that have also been catalogued in TEI. 6 were purchased at London auction houses between 1916 and 1934, so within Henry Wellcome's lifetime, and 5 are of unknown provenance. The contents varies and includes 6 medieval romance palm leaves. During inventory, an additional 12th manuscript was found. It has both unknown provenance and content. As we're unable to read the text, we don't know what the subject matter is. So this highlights the importance of inventory, but also how much we don't know about our collections. And I think there's often an expectation that we have far greater knowledge and expertise than we actually do. Next slide, please. So the Malay collections, unlike the other global manuscript collections, are papers from D.F.A. Harvey, a late 19th century British colonial administrator of the Straits Civil Service. They're written in English, Malay, and Arabic, and information gathered by himself and his employees, and include lists of terms and uses for plants and animals, notes on legal practices, and prices of rice varieties. And the catalogue from 1981 states that Hervé's was a respectable rather than outstanding career, and goes on to make quite surprising speculations about the state of his mental health, such as the somewhat neurotic character may explain Hervé's hesitancy as a scholar, as well as his timidity as a traveller. So there's multiple ways of viewing and interpreting an interpretation which changes with time. So is this a manuscript collection about Malay culture or an archive collection about a British colonial administrator?
Yeah, thank you, Yoshika. And that's exactly the kind of reflection that we end up making quite often as we work through these collections and get to acquaint ourselves with them as we go along. The questions of reconfiguring them, for instance, in this case, is it really a manuscript collection or is it an archive collection? And I think this element of reworking the meaning of collections is something that we're also keen to explore when it comes to the subject of restitution, which has been raised several times here today. Wellcome Collection has already been active in terms to repatriating human remains, but we're also very eager to be proactive when it comes to broadening the scope of the restitution debate to also include archive and library material, particularly manuscripts. So Yoshika and I were both part of a Headley Fellowship funded by the Art Fund, which is developing currently a framework for the restitution of part of our Jain manuscript collections to Jain communities of London and the UK, which is again speaking to an overall strategy, a new strategy that is under development within Wellcome Collection. You see here an image of one of the Jain manuscripts that we hold at Wellcome Collection, yet another uncatalogued text, but one that is now part of the discussions for this upcoming restitution framework, precisely because it is the kind of material that has a more has a fuller life outside of the archive and library space. So with that, we will stop talking. We're happy to take any questions, and you have our email addresses there if you have any kind of questions you'd like to come up and share with us beyond this this panel. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Adrian and Yoshika, for this final presentation. Now we are opening the floor to questions. So for our audience who's listening, if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A box. Let's see if we have any. I think we don't have any yet at the moment. So perhaps if I could just start by asking a general question to all our presenters today. So all of you at one point or another mentioned a bit more how all the research ongoing now is looking more into the histories of these objects, colonial context of collecting or provenance of these objects. Could you share a bit more about future plans of the possible outputs from this research? So for the Wellcome Collection, for example, we heard that some of these inventory and information, the TEI, would be made available open access. What about for the V&A and the British Museum? What are some of the possible programs or exhibition programs or research perhaps that might be possible in the future that will highlight some of these histories of the Southeast Asian materials in your collections?
Alex, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can speak first. So in terms of the raffles, the work that we have done to date can be found in the exhibition catalog from 2019 that was published by the Asian Civilizations Museum. It's called Raffles in Southeast Asia, Rethinking the Scholar and Statesman. But then also you can go to britishmuseum.org and look at our collections online and all the research that we have done. If you just enter the name Stanford Raffles, actually Thomas Stanford Raffles, then you'll be able to find all the Raffles collections. And if you click on each link to each object, you'll be able to see in the curatorial comment all the information that we have managed to gather. So for the drawings, that involves saying, you know, a version of this drawing is also in the Royal Asiatic Society, and giving that information, who drew the piece, if we were able to figure that out, and so forth. And then the same thing with the theatrical materials. So we had a number of scholars looking at it, and we have done an initial assessment. So we'll be able to say, you know, we think this one is from Cirebon, and we think this one's from Central Java, possibly Surakarta, or maybe Yogyakarta, or this one came, you know, this gamelan instrument came from Madura, that sort of thing. All that information, the general information that we have. So the more specific information that we're trying to do this year, again, that material will also be published will be presented in the collections online. So any discoveries we find will be entered there. But then we're also hoping to publish an article, possibly in the Journal for Southeast Asian Studies, that looks at provenance more of the Raffles collection more specifically. And that's kind of what we have planned to date, but we're also thinking about possibly putting in a larger grant proposal, perhaps an AHRC grant proposal, again, to take this even further, possibly, you know, in the long run with another exhibition or something. But that's to be determined.
Thanks very much, Alex. So I think with the V&A, with the Southeast Asian collections, I think there's always, I think in a way this is nothing new. There's always been a great interest in researching and publishing the provenance of our objects. I'm really more familiar with the South Asian collections in Southeast Asia, but my late colleague John Clark did a lot of research on provenance for Southeast Asian and Himalayan objects. I mentioned the Mandalay Shrine and the Mandalay Regalia. I mean, John certainly worked on those and published his work. The museum has all the museum's objects are on our CMS database. All the objects on our database are available online through the museum's Explore the Collections module. So all that information, with the exception of things like the location database, but the vast majority are available to the public. So all the kind of public-facing information can be easily seen. And I think what we're doing over a long period of time gradually is increasing the amount of information that we have on that database, particularly concerning provenance. And now, because it's a huge collection, so this is an absolutely vast amount of work, and the research needs to be done into the files. Some of that has already been done, others is still to do. As it happens, we were looking into the Cambodian material recently. A volunteer had several years ago already put the provenance information onto the database, so that was therefore already available on Explore the Collections. But about a year ago, one of my colleagues went through and checked and corrected one or two things to make sure that things were up to speed, so that all the Cambodian provenances were available and Explore the Collection. So bits, and it's a little bit piecemeal, doing bits of work on particular projects according to when things come up, either as inquiries or pieces that are needed for display, or when they are the subject of publication projects. But things just are sort of are moving forward in little bits, I suppose, or in larger waves. As I mentioned, the Cambodian question about objects looted during the Cambodian Civil War, that was a cause for us to go through all of our files. I think what it reveals is that we can easily see the information that's in our files. What's much harder is the much more in-depth research that's required to find out how a particular collector who gave a particular object to the V&A, let's say, how that collector got hold of the object in the first place. And that's much more difficult research. I think, in some areas, obviously, we try to work on that, but for the whole collection, that will be that would be a project that would take a long time, and obviously it's it's good to work with other projects other partners who might be working more proactively on particular types of objects. We are in a sense a little bit in limbo because, as I say, my colleague John passed away. I'm kind of holding the fort temporarily, but without the kind of level of expertise that John had. My colleague Sao Fang Chan deals with our Southeast Asian textiles, so she may well have projects. I mean, she's just completed a book on Chinese textiles, so she may well have projects in mind herself. But I wanted to just mention in a broader context what we're trying to do with the South and Southeast Asian collections. So when our South Asia gallery, we had a rehang of our 80 or so paintings on display last March, and what we did this time for the first time, sounds like a sort of bit of a small step, but we used to include on our labels provenance information only when an object had been given, bequeathed or loaned to the museum. And now we've put in the information for those paintings, those 80 paintings. We've also put in where they were bought from. So just a sort of tombstone, basic minimal information, so that people have something immediately visible in the gallery, as well as what they can find out through search the collections. And as we think about a redisplay of our South Asia gallery, I think one of the key aspects of that is going to be to have more provenance information, more very overt displays about how the collection was put together. I mean, it's very much the kind of brainstorming phase. So I don't want to say too much because we don't know what ultimately will be decided for the gallery. But I think those are the kind of issues that we're thinking about. That applies to South Asia. I'm sure that in the course of time we will be giving thought to how not only to improve our online records, but also how to improve our gallery records. Our gallery labels for the Southeast Asian collections as well. And sorry, one other thing to mention is that we have had a project with a researcher working very specifically for I think about 6 months on the provenance of objects from China in the museum's collection bought in the 19th century. I think that there's hope that those specific projects where someone looks at a particular group of material, it might be 19th century Indian purchases, or it might be pieces from Tibet. There are all sorts of different ways of subject areas that need addressing. So getting particular researchers in to do in-depth work on a particular part of the collection is another way of moving this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick and Alexandra. Sorry. Yes, Adrian, please.
Sorry, no, thank you. But just asking, do you want us to add to that in any kind of way?
Yes,
or
please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Alexandra and Nick for that. I just wanted to just add a reflection or comment or whatever you want to call it. That yeah, so we've also welcome digitized all our accession registers and put them online, so you can look through all of those. And same with most of the reports, the notebooks, the journals, and all that from all the purchasing agents that were active. And we also have an internal transcribe-thon project ongoing, which aims to transcribe all this material so it would be searchable and facilitate research a little bit better. I think this is all important, but I think it's also really important to acknowledge that as Nick, as you pointed out, I think an important part of provenance research is also understanding more of the context of any particular kind of purchase, because you can, even in some cases, if you find absolutely all that you know about the particular kind of purchase of one item, or quite a lot of this kind of sort of technical information about the provenance of a particular item, a lot of the context might still be lost. So, for instance, one of the purchasing agents that Wellcome employed had 30 years in the British India Army before he started as a purchasing agent. So the context in which he showed up to haggle, for instance, on prices within British occupied India was very different. And when it then shows up that he purchased a particular item for a certain price in the accessions register, that's really only a little bit of a small part of the picture. So I really applaud this kind of project that you mentioned, where we try and facilitate in-depth research about the wider context and of the collecting activities of the past. Yes. Sorry. Thank you.
So thank you all for your comments, because that actually brings me to the next question I want to bring forward also in connection to some questions we have in the Q&A. So all of you mentioned working with particular researchers who have expertise or relationship from the communities of origin. So especially for the Welcome collection, I think we have a few particular questions in the Q&A about identification of particular manuscripts or what is included in these. And you mentioned in your presentation also that you don't know about the contents of some of these. So is this also something that moving forward you will work more with people who can identify the content?
Yeah, most certainly, absolutely, and I see several of the questions in the Q&A, and there's now that some of the questions I could respond to, but many of them
Please
I
go
don't
ahead.
know the answer to. But I think that's exactly the kind of approach that we decided on taking a couple of years back. Then rather than having exquisite information about a limited amount of material, we'd want to have basic amount of information about as much material as possible, and then rather be proven wrong or ignorant about some of it, and then be able to build on that information and improve it. So any kinds of course input that we might receive would be very happy to make changes. That's also one of the reasons why the TEI files are open access. That's also so that anybody can push changes to them if they want to, and we can take on board those changes and make the changes on the front end. But we also have a couple of projects running in collaboration with various community groups and researchers to make sure that this doesn't become a sort of an ad hoc and, well, frankly, exploitative practice where people's expertise and knowledge is just given for free. So we're working to develop that. We have several smaller projects ongoing, and I think it's something we want to see a lot more of over the next couple of years on the basis of the information that we managed to establish so far.
Thank you, Adrian, for this. We have also a few more general questions from the Q&A to all the speakers. It's a more general question about collection management now. So what kind of provisions are in place in your respective institutions in terms of protecting and maintaining donations in your museums, or whether in perpetuity, for example? Do you have any comments about that?
I would, if I may just leap in there, I imagine that the frameworks for each institution are somewhat different. So the UK is controlled by the UK Heritage Act of, I think, 2003. The British Museum is controlled by an earlier act of Parliament. The UK Heritage Act forbids us from deaccessioning objects in our collection unless they are unusable, which means of no use to the public, which basically means they're broken beyond repair. So it's a real, that's quite a, in issues where we feel there's there might be a really powerful ethical case for restitution, that does create an issue, and it's caused our museum to try to talk to countries of origin about possible long-term loans of certain objects. But at the moment we are, as I understand it, I mean, I think there are certain details of the Charities Act by which there may be some, I don't know, but some ways some mechanism for finding a way around that more recently. But basically we are not allowed to deaccession objects from the V&A, and I imagine that the situation in the Wellcome Institute is very different, because you wouldn't be governed by that legislation.
Yeah, yes. So Wellcome Collection and Wellcome Trust, for that matter, being a private institution, is not bound by that legislation, so can deaccession up to its own, make its own decisions about that. And I think, yeah, that's true. So we're in a very different position, and we're able to make different kinds of decisions based on that.
And Alexandra, do you have anything
I mean,
to share?
Nick has said it all. I mean, we're bound by an act of parliament. We cannot deaccession.
Thank you. So Let's see if there's any particular. Maybe I can ask another general question, since this our program is called Reconnect, Recollect, and all of us today are discussing about Southeast Asian heritage, cultural materials. I want to invite the panelists to connect a bit with each other's presentations. So do you see some synergies between your respective collections, approaches? Do you see possibilities for future collaborations? How can we relook some of these materials of Southeast Asian origin in your respective institutions?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I feel that we're all essentially on the same page, frankly, that we're doing very similar types of work. We're trying to make materials available to the public in many of the same ways. I think there's lots of overlap, and we do collaborate. We collaborate all the time. So, for example, the Welcome is going to be loaning a Burmese manuscript to the Myanmar exhibition that we're holding at the British Museum in November, starting in November this year. And the VNA is also going to be loaning materials to that show. So, you know, we collaborate in many and varied ways. And as I said, I feel that we're all effectively doing very, very similar work. Obviously, our collections differ, but our approaches are very similar.
And I enjoyed, if I may say, you know, the sort of the way, Alex, that you were talking about doing the research into the real nuances of provenance within Raffles' collection. So really trying to dig into that detail of how he acquired those objects. I mean, that's something that I think that you know, we all aspire to do. We can only do it because of the limitations of time and resources. We can only do it with little chunks at a time, but certainly we're all very interested in that kind of approach. And likewise, you know, Adrian, I think the sort of and Yoshika, the sort of work that you're doing with the making manuscripts more widely available online, that's really interesting to see. You know, I think, you know, we're trying to put as much as possible, as much information as we can on our website, but I think, yeah, I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I at the moment we're not really going beyond that, other than contributing our images to other projects. For example, you were talking about Jain manuscripts. You know, our Jain manuscripts are available for the Jainpedia website, and you know, it's searchable through that. So there are different ways of collaborating with other organizations to bring that forward, as well as what you can develop within your own institution.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just to add to what you're saying, Nick, I mean, I think it's a matter of resources. I'm the only curator for Southeast Asia. We have more than 31,000 Southeast Asian objects at the British Museum. All of them are online. You can search our entire database through the collections online. And again, you know, I'm one person, and, you know, there's only so much, only 24 hours in the day.
So yes, Adrian or Yoshika, do you have anything to add to a comment or no?
Well, just want to say that again, it just underline the same, that we really enjoyed hearing everybody's presentations, and also sad that Sadia couldn't be with us for the roundtable. It was really exciting to hear about her work, and I hope that's something that we can all learn more from in the future. And I can only echo what Alexandra and Nick have just been saying. I think yeah, I think any kind of collections management also comes down to the fact that, I mean, collections are endless and time is not, and people are limited, and yeah, it ends up, yeah, the way it does because of those factors, of course. Yes.
So thank you all the panelists for your comments and discussions. We do have a few very particular questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure the curators are happy for you to get in touch if you have more specific questions. And for now, maybe I just bring back to Farah and to wrap up the session. Farah? You're still on mute, Farah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Melinda. Well, as we reach the end of our introductory session, and also this is the final research seminar, I cannot thank you all enough. Melinda, Nick, Yoshika, Adrian, Alexandra, also Sadia, who just have to go. But I think that it's not only thanking you for being here and also like to share, making your time for this session, but also your rigorous work of taking care and also curating and researching on these. Basically, like these are like objects that are very close to us and close to our heart. As I mean, like for me, like the Indonesian, and I can speak also on behalf of many, I guess. And well, I mean, like I cannot thank you all enough. And like I said, this is like the final research seminar. But then we have like the theory club with Stefania Zambini from Science Museum, very much based on the Congress Engine project of SMG. It's going to be like the end of March. But for now, again, like I also thank all the participants and attendees, and really, really interesting, fascinating discussions that have been done from these 2 weeks. So I think that's a wrap for the research seminars, and again for the distinguished speakers. Yes, we express our like greatest appreciation. Also from Melinda, like the best moderator. Yeah, and bearing with all the like, it's been an exciting 2 hours. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah. Bye bye.
Thank you very much indeed.